Yesterday, we talked about the solid state hydrogen that can be transported like normal cargo by trucks, trains, and ordinary ships at room temperature. And today, we discuss how that hydride can turn into lethal weapons more dreadful or useful than those nuclear weapons held by the US and Russia. Let's start with a simple but unsettling idea. For decades, deterrence meant one thing: bigger explosions. So engineers are pursuing more megatons, bigger fireballs, and faster missiles. The entire logic of global security, especially between China and the United States, was built around the terrifying promise of nuclear annihilation. The bigger your blast, the stronger your deterrence. But what if that logic is changing? What if the next generation of deterrence is not about destroying cities, but about melting ships, frying electronics, and disabling fleets without triggering nuclear war? That is where China's emerging hydrogen-based thermal approach starts to matter. And if we zoom out, that is not just a weapons story. It is also a story about physics, logistics, industrial policy, and geopolitics, as well as a quiet but serious shift in how power is projected at sea. Now let's take the core of the idea further and expand it properly, step by step, because the implications are much bigger than they look at first glance. Here, we bypass traditional explosive shock waves to analyze China's pivot toward extreme thermal energy as the primary maritime deterrent. It signals a complete shift in military thinking. Traditional weapons are built around shock waves. Explosions release energy extremely fast, creating pressure that crushes structures, shatters materials, and causes immediate destruction. Bullets moved faster than arrows, so thousands of Western warriors defeated China's Qing dynasty, forcing it to sign unequal treaties, even though the latter fielded millions of troops. Fletchers have become artists nowadays, as arrows are not weapons on the modern battlefields. That is how bombs and artillery have worked for 2 centuries. That is why China's Chairman Mao vowed to have missiles to counteract the US, and why he desperately needed atomic bombs to deter the USA and the USSR. History is at a crossroads again. A new era is coming into shape, and heat will replace fusion, at least for China. Just like China's electric cars defeat traditional combustion vehicles from Japan, Germany, and the US, Beijing is trying to negate America's and Russia's nuclear stockpile. China's pivot suggests something different. Instead of releasing energy instantly, the goal is to control how energy is delivered, stretching it over time and focusing it into heat rather than pressure. Because shock waves are chaotic and difficult to control, they destroy everything in range, but they are inefficient if your goal is to turn off specific systems. Heat, on the other hand, can be directed, sustained, and focused. Extreme thermal energy does not just damage, it transforms materials. Steel softens, electronics fail, coatings burn, sensors degrade. Instead of blowing something apart, the Chinese make it unusable. That is a fundamentally different way to think about deterrence. By prioritizing sustained heat over instant kinetic pressure, Beijing maps a strategic shift designed to melt carrier hulls and neutralize Western electronics. Let's break that down further. Sustained heat means the energy is applied long enough to overcome material resistance. A quick burst might scorch a surface, but sustained exposure can weaken structural integrity. Aircraft carriers are not fragile. They are designed to survive explosions, impacts, and extreme stress. But they are not designed to sit under continuous extreme heat. Flight decks rely on specialized materials to withstand jet exhaust, but those limits can be exceeded. Prolonged exposure to high temperatures can warp surfaces, making aircraft operations dangerous or impossible. Internal systems depend on stable temperatures. Overheating can cascade through power systems, sensors, and control networks. Neutralizing electronics is even more critical. Modern naval warfare is built on electronics. Radar, communication systems, targeting systems, and missile guidance all depend on sensitive components. Heat does not need to destroy them physically. It just needs to push them outside their operating limits. It is like destroying a computer. It suffices to overheat the CPU to 200 degrees Celsius. Burn the CPU, the motherboard, and the computer dies. Similarly, a ship without functioning electronics is no longer a fighting platform. It is just a large piece of metal floating in the ocean. So instead of sinking a carrier, which is extremely difficult and escalatory, the goal becomes turning it off. That is where redefining regional naval superiority through physics-based dominance becomes important. Physics-based dominance means exploiting the fundamental properties of materials and energy rather than relying solely on firepower numbers. It is about understanding what systems cannot tolerate and designing weapons that target those weaknesses. Instead of asking how we destroy the ship, the question becomes how we make it unusable. That is a subtle but powerful shift. Now let's connect this to China's broader strategic situation. China faces a structural challenge. The United States has decades of experience operating carrier strike groups across the world. Its navy is built for global dominance. China's navy is growing rapidly, but matching the United States ship for ship would be extremely expensive and time-consuming. So China looks for asymmetry. Asymmetry means finding ways to counter an opponent's strengths without directly matching them. Anti-ship ballistic missiles were one example, designed to threaten carriers from long distances. But even those rely on traditional kinetic or explosive approaches. Thermal-based systems represent another layer of asymmetry. They target what carriers depend on, rather than the carriers themselves. It ties into a broader trend in modern warfare, the move from platform-centric warfare to system-centric warfare. In platform-centric warfare, the focus is on ships, planes, and tanks. In system-centric warfare, the focus is on networks, sensors, and the integration. Instead of exterminating a person physically, making him a martyr, you disarray his nerves, making him a lunatic, like some in the White House. Neutralize the system, and the platform becomes irrelevant. Now let's bring hydrogen into the picture, because this is where things become even more interesting. Hydrogen is usually discussed in the context of energy, not weapons, as we revealed in yesterday's video. It is seen as a clean fuel, a future replacement for fossil fuels, and a key component of decarbonization strategies. But hydrogen also has unique physical properties. It can store energy in a compact form, burn at high temperatures, and be used in different types of reactions to release energy in controlled ways. That opens the door to dual-use applications. A hydrogen energy storage system can also be adapted for military purposes. A container designed to transport hydrogen safely could be modified to deliver energy differently. That is where the idea of containerization becomes strategically important. For decades, hydrogen faced a major problem: logistics. It is difficult to transport and store, requiring high-pressure tanks or extremely low temperatures. That made large-scale deployment expensive and complex. Recent developments in modular systems aim to solve this. Instead of building massive centralized infrastructure, hydrogen can be stored and transported in standardized containers. These containers can be moved by ships, trucks, or trains, just like any other cargo. Now think about what that means from a military perspective. We have a system that looks civilian, behaves like civilian logistics, but it could potentially support military functions. That creates ambiguity. Ambiguity is powerful in deterrence because it complicates the opponent's decision-making. If we cannot easily distinguish between civilian and military assets, our options become limited. Striking those assets risks escalation or political backlash. So, containerized hydrogen systems are not just about efficiency, they are about flexibility and uncertainty. This ties into the idea of distributed systems. Traditional military infrastructure is centralized, with large bases, fixed installations, and clearly identifiable targets. Distributed systems spread capability across many smaller nodes. Containerized systems can be deployed widely, moved quickly, and hidden in plain sight. That makes them harder to target and easier to scale. Now let's return to the concept of deterrence, because everything we are discussing feeds into a new model. Classic nuclear deterrence is based on the threat of destruction. It works at the highest level of conflict, but it is not useful for lower level confrontations. Russia has not used it in the Ukraine war, and Israel has not used it in the conflict with Iran. Sometimes the nuclear bombs are like white elephants in a room. Modern geopolitical competition often operates below that threshold. Countries push boundaries without crossing the line into full-scale war. That is where non-nuclear high-impact systems become valuable. They provide credible options that can be used without triggering nuclear escalation. Hydrogen-based thermal systems could fit into this category. They offer significant impact, the ability to turn off high-value targets without the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons. That creates a more flexible deterrence posture. Instead of a binary choice between doing nothing and escalating massively, there are more options in between. It is sometimes described as filling the escalation ladder. Each step represents a different level of force. The more steps you have, the more control you have over how a conflict evolves. China's interest in these systems can be understood in this context. It is not just about technology. It is about shaping the range of options available in a crisis. Now let's look at the implications for the United States. The U.S. Navy is built around carrier strike groups. These are complex systems designed to project power globally. They rely on layers of defense, missile interception, electronic warfare, and coordinated operations. But they are optimized for certain types of threats. Missiles, aircraft, and submarines are the traditional challenges. Sustained thermal stress is not a typical threat scenario. It creates a potential gap. If an adversary develops systems that exploit that gap, it forces adaptation. New defenses, new materials, new operational concepts. That is how military competition evolves. One side introduces a new capability, the other side responds, and the cycle continues. But the key point is timing. If one side gains an advantage in a new domain, even temporarily, it can shift the balance in specific regions. In the context of the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, even a limited advantage could have significant consequences. Now, let's talk about escalation dynamics, because this is where things become particularly sensitive. Nuclear weapons create immediate, extreme escalation. Their use is almost unthinkable because of the consequences. In human history, Japan is the only country that suffered from atomic attacks. Every country knows the consequences. And every nation knows that if a nuclear attack is initiated, it is not targeting one country, but all that possess nuclear warheads. The US, Russia, China, France, Britain, India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel, and Iran. Because the nuclear power that survived would dominate the world if it were not destroyed. Everyone wants their enemy to die, not killed by their enemies or even allies in a nuclear war. Conventional weapons are more usable before the conflict escalates to the nuclear level, but they may not be sufficient to deter high-end threats. Thermal-based systems could sit in between. They are not nuclear, so they avoid the highest level of escalation, but they are more impactful than many conventional systems. It creates a new category of deterrence, one that is powerful enough to matter, but constrained enough to be usable. For example, China does not even have to kill a soldier before actualizing its dream of ruining a U.S. supercarrier. Flip a switch quietly, and it is done. Simple and easy. In short, it has both stabilizing and destabilizing effects. On the one hand, it provides more options, which can help manage crises. On the other hand, it lowers the threshold for using force because the consequences are less extreme than nuclear weapons. It could make conflicts more likely, even if it makes them less catastrophic. Now let's bring the discussion back to the broader geopolitical competition between China and the United States. This competition is not just military, it is technological, economic, and industrial. Hydrogen sits at the intersection of all three. As an energy carrier, it is central to future energy systems. As an industrial input, it supports manufacturing and heavy industry. As a potential military component, it adds another layer of strategic value. China has invested heavily in hydrogen infrastructure, production, and research. That gives it a potential advantage in scaling these systems. The United States is also investing, but the approaches differ. China tends to focus on large-scale deployment and integration, building entire ecosystems around new technologies. The United States often emphasizes innovation and private sector development. Both approaches have strengths and weaknesses. But in a strategic competition, what matters is how these technologies translate into capabilities. If hydrogen infrastructure enables both energy security and military flexibility, it becomes a strategic asset. That is where the line between civilian and military becomes blurred. Dual-use technologies are not new, but hydrogen could become one of the most significant examples. Now let's consider the psychological dimension, because deterrence is as much about perception as it is about capability. If decision makers believe their assets are vulnerable, even in ways not fully understood, it affects their behavior. Uncertainty creates caution. If U.S. commanders begin to consider the possibility that new types of weapons could turn off their ships, it changes risk calculations. Routes might be adjusted, operations might become more conservative, and deployment patterns might shift. All of this can happen even before a single shot is fired. That is the power of deterrence. It works by shaping decisions, not just by threatening destruction. Now let's look forward, because everything we have discussed is still developing. Hydrogen-based thermal systems are not yet a dominant force in warfare. They are part of a broader trend toward new types of weapons. Directed energy weapons, such as lasers, also focus on delivering energy precisely. Electromagnetic systems aim to disrupt electronics. Autonomous systems change how platforms are deployed. All of these trends point in the same direction: more precision, more control, more focus on systems rather than platforms. The future of warfare may be less about large-scale destruction and more about targeted disruption. That does not mean it will be less dangerous. In some ways, it could be more complex and unpredictable, because the boundaries between peace and conflict become less clear. Now let's return to the original idea one more time. By prioritizing sustained heat over instant kinetic pressure, China is exploring a different path to deterrence, one that leverages physics in a new way, one that aligns with broader technological and industrial trends, one that fits into the gray zones of modern geopolitics, and one that directly challenges the assumptions that have shaped military strategy for decades. The competition between China and the United States will continue to evolve. A single technology will not decide it, but shifts like this matter, because they change how both sides think about power, risk, and conflict. And sometimes, the biggest changes are not the loudest ones, not the explosions that light up the sky, but the quieter shifts, the ones that redefine the rules of the game before anyone fully realizes it has changed. If hydrogen becomes not just an energy solution, but a tool of deterrence, we are looking at a future where power is measured not just in firepower, but in control of energy itself. And that is a very different kind of world. And China is at its center.